In 2004, a bright 13-year-old girl on a routine school field trip vanished without a trace near the crumbling ruins of an ancient fortress. Authorities suggested she'd simply wandered off, lost in childish curiosity, but no footprints, no clothing, not a single strand of hair was ever recovered. For 6 long years, silence hung heavy until archaeologists digging near the ruins unearthed something chilling, a half-buried satchel, torn open, its contents frozen in time. And inside, they discovered an object that rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about her disappearance. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and pine, the kind of day that should have promised nothing more than laughter and the soft shuffle of sneakers on a school outing. But beneath the bright sky and the chattering voices of excited teenagers, the silence of the ruins they were destined to visit lingered like a warning no one wanted to hear. It was spring. 2004. The yellow bus rattled along a narrow rural road, its windows fogged with the collective breath of 30 students pressed eagerly against the glass. The fortress ruins loomed in the distance, a skeletal reminder of centuries of battles, now reduced to broken walls, swallowed by moss and shadow. To the children, it was just another adventure. To the teachers, it was a carefully planned lesson in history. To one girl in particular, it was something else entirely, an escape, a mystery waiting to be uncovered. "Look," she whispered to her friend beside her, pointing at the jagged outline of stone against the sky. "Doesn't it look like it's hiding something?" Her eyes lit with the kind of curiosity that could pull her away from the safety of the group, the kind of imagination that couldn't be contained by worksheets or chaperones. Her friend laughed. "It's just rocks. You'll see, it's boring." But she shook her head. "No. Places like this, they keep secrets." The bus screeched to a halt, brakes groaning. Students spilled out in a rush of chatter, their voices bouncing across the open field. The air here was cooler, almost damp, and the wind carried a faint, hollow whistle through the gaps in the fortress walls. The teacher raised her clipboard, shouting instructions over the noise, reminding them to stay in groups, not to wander, to meet back at the central courtyard in an hour. "Stay close," the girl's mother had warned that morning. She had nodded, promised she would. But promises made in the comfort of home often dissolve when faced with the pull of the unknown. The ruins stretched like a labyrinth, half devoured by creeping ivy. The ground was uneven, scattered with fallen stone and patches of weeds. The children darted through archways, shouting echoes, laughing when their voices returned, distorted and strange. But the girl lingered. Her fingers trailed across the rough stone, eyes scanning cracks and hollow recesses. She tilted her head listening. Was that just the wind, or something else moving deeper within? Her classmates tugged at her sleeve. "Come on, we're going to see the tower." She smiled faintly, distracted. "I'll catch up." They didn't wait. And so, slowly, unnoticed, she drifted away, down a narrow path shaded by the broken remains of an archway, into the shadows where sunlight faltered. Minutes later, the teacher began her roll call, clipboard in hand, her voice echoing across the courtyard. The names rang out one after another, met by playful here's and presents. Then she called the girl's name. Silent. She frowned, called it again, louder this time. The chatter dimmed. Students glanced around, searching the crowd, waiting for her hand to shoot up. But the space where she should have stood remained empty. The teacher's voice trembled as she called a third time, echoing into the ruins. Still, only silence. The first scream of her name rang out sharp against the stone walls, a note of panic that cut through the children's laughter like a blade. At first, no one believed anything was wrong. Students scattered among the ruins all the time, ducking behind crumbling arches, daring each other to sneak into half-collapsed tunnels. But this time, the girl didn't come running back with a grin, didn't answer the teacher's rising voice. "Check the courtyard," the teacher barked, clipboard clutched tight against her chest. Her voice quivered, but she forced it steady. Students obeyed, their sneakers thudding against the uneven earth as they fanned out in pairs. Giggles faded into whispers. A creeping unease took their place. The ruins seemed to stretch further now, as if shadows had multiplied with every passing second. Wind sighed through hollow gaps, carrying with it the illusion of movement, branches shifting, pebbles skittering. "She's probably hiding," a boy muttered, half to convince himself. "She likes to scare people." Minutes turned into an hour. The laughter never returned. When the bus driver stepped off his seat to ask what was going on, the teacher's face told him everything. A call was made, first to the local authorities, then hesitantly, fearfully, to the parent. By the time the police arrived, the sun had begun to dip lower, stretching shadows across the ruins like dark fingers. Their uniforms looked strangely out of place in the wilderness, their boots sinking into the soft, damp ground as they scanned the perimeter. "She's 13, the teacher explained breathlessly, her words tripping over themselves. "She was right here. We called her name. We've checked everywhere." One officer scribbled notes. Another adjusted his cap. "It's common," he said flatly. "Kids wander off. She'll turn up. Maybe she wanted some time alone." The teacher's face went pale. Not here, not in this place. But the authorities clung to the simplest explanation. A runaway, a childish game gone too far, perhaps even a girl who'd gotten lost in the brush. They promised she'd be found. They always said that in the beginning. By dusk her parents had arrived. The mother stumbled from the car, eyes already red, hands shaking as she grabbed the nearest officer by the arm. "Where is she?" she demanded. "Where's my daughter?" No one had an answer. The ruins glowed faintly orange in the dying light, stone walls casting jagged shadows across the field. Volunteers combed through the undergrowth, calling her name, their flashlights beginning to slice through the encroaching dark. The girl's father joined them, moving with frantic energy, tripping over roots, brushing aside branches with bare hands. "She hates the dark," he muttered again and again, as though saying it aloud might summon her. Then the dogs were brought in. Lean, eager creatures, straining at their leashes, noses pressed to the ground where her classmates swore she had last stood. For a moment, hope flickered. The dogs barked, surged forward, pulling handlers toward the shadowed edge of the ruin. The crowd followed, every eye fixed on that one possible thread leading them to her. They moved past the courtyard, past the tower, where ivy coiled upward like veins, into the tree line that bordered the ruins. The earth was soft, scattered with leaves and brittle twigs snapping under boots. The handlers urged the dogs on. The air grew colder, stiller, and then nothing. The dogs stopped, circled once, whined, their noses lifted toward the air, confused. Handlers tugged their leashes, urging them forward, but the animals balked, trembling, refusing to take another step. The trail was gone. The girl had simply vanished. By nightfall, hope gave way to something heavier. Flashlights swept endlessly across stone and soil, illuminating nothing. The ruins stood silent, ancient, indifferent, as though they had swallowed her whole and sealed themselves shut. And at the edge of that silence, where the dogs refused to step further, her parents stood frozen, staring into the dark, as though it had stolen her away. The morning after the frantic search, the ruins were cloaked in mist, the kind that seemed to rise from the earth itself, veiling stone and forest in a pale, suffocating shroud. Search teams returned with bleary eyes and mud-caked boots, but no one had slept. The girl's absence had stretched from hours into the unthinkable, an entire night. In the cramped mobile command tent set up near the field, detectives shuffled papers, radios crackled, and maps lay unrolled across folding tables. But for all the noise, the truth was silence. There was no trace. One officer, leaning back in his chair, spoke with the kind of cold certainty that only distance could allow. "Most likely scenario, she wandered into the woods. Got turned around. Kids do it all the time." Her father slammed his palm against the table. "My daughter doesn't just wander off. She knows better. She's careful." His voice cracked, raw from shouting her name through the ruins all night. "And if she did get lost, where are the footprints? Where's her backpack? Where's anything?" But the theories flowed all the same. Some whispered that she had run away, an impulsive decision sparked by teenage restlessness. A runaway case was always easier to file than something darker, something inexplicable. Others suggested she may have slipped into one of the fortress's hidden shafts. those narrow, deadly drops left behind by centuries of erosion. If that were true, she could be trapped deep underground, invisible beneath the snow. Her mother clutched the girl's sweater, still folded neatly from her school bag. "She wouldn't leave us," she whispered to the detectives. She was excited. She loved history. This trip meant everything to her. Why would she vanish on this day of all days? The detectives had no answer, but they had procedure. They measured distances, interviewed classmates, and wrote long reports, filled with neat boxes and official language. No evidence of foul play, one report concluded. Yet there was nothing. No scuff marks on stone, no broken branches, no strands of hair caught in ivy. Not even the faintest impression of her in the soil where she had last been seen. It was as though the earth had simply opened and consumed her whole. Still, stories began to spread. A villager, an old man with eyes clouded by cataracts, shuffled into the police cordon one evening. His voice rasped with age, but his words carried weight. "I saw her," he muttered. "By the ruins. A figure in white. She wasn't alone." The detectives exchanged weary glances. "You saw someone else?" But the old man only shook his head. "No, not someone. Something." The statement was dismissed, written off as the ramblings of an elder with a taste for folklore. Yet whispers crept through the village that night, of curses tied to the ruins, of children who once disappeared in the same place, generations ago. Parents pulled their own children closer, doors were locked earlier, and still the ruins stood silent, indifferent. For the girl's parents, the days became a blur of frustration and grief. They clashed with detectives, begged volunteers to search further, pushed through thickets and stone corridors on their own. Each unanswered question grew heavier, a weight pressing on their chests until even breathing felt impossible. By the end of the second week, the official narrative had crystallized. A runaway, or perhaps an accident. Nothing criminal, nothing extraordinary, just another tragedy to file away. But in the quiet hours of the night, when her mother stared at the empty bed in her daughter's room, one thought refused to let go. If she had simply run away, why had the ruins themselves felt so alive, so intent on swallowing her whole? The third day dawned gray and heavy, clouds sagging low over the fortress ruins, as if the sky itself carried the weight of dread. The field was no longer filled with the chatter of children or the clipped instructions of teachers. It had transformed into something far more haunting, a staging ground. Rescue trucks lined the narrow road, their engines rumbling in the damp morning air. Volunteers in neon vests stood shoulder to shoulder, their boots pressed into the wet earth, waiting for instructions. Helicopter blades chopped through the mist above, the sound echoing like a war drum across the hills. For the first time in centuries, the ruins were alive again, not with soldiers or kings, but with desperate men and women combing every inch of its soil. From the command post, the lead officer raised his voice above the din. "Grid searches will extend into the northern forest. Teams of 4, no one breaks formation. Every inch must be checked." The girl's father stood among them, his eyes hollow but burning. He refused to stay behind, refused to let strangers comb the land where his daughter had last been seen. Mud caked his shoes, his palms bled from pushing through thorns the night before, but his resolve was unshaken. "I'll go where you won't," he muttered under his breath, a vow to himself as much as to the faceless officers. The ruins loomed above them, broken towers jutting into the gray like jagged teeth. Volunteers swept the fields with sticks, probing undergrowth, overturning stones. Some called her name softly, almost tenderly, as though afraid to break the silence that hung so oppressively over the place. Hours passed. The air grew colder, damper. Searchers descended into half-collapsed tunnels, their flashlights slicing through suffocating darkness, beams catching on carved stone walls, slick with centuries of condensation. "Nothing," one muttered, voice echoing too loud in the hollow space. Another shivered and glanced over his shoulder. "Feels like we're not supposed to be here." Above ground, locals gathered near the perimeter, whispering to each other in hushed tones. Rumors clung to the ruins like ivy of bodies never recovered. Of soldiers lost beneath its catacombs, of children swallowed whole by the earth. One woman clutched her shawl tightly around her shoulders and said to another, "Mark my words, the place doesn't give back what it takes." By midday, a murmur rippled through the volunteers. A rescue worker knelt in the mud at the edge of the ruins, holding something in his hand. A shoe print, small, delicate, unmistakably a child's, pressed into the damp earth. The girl's father pushed forward, hope igniting in his chest for the first time in days. "That's hers. It has to be." The handler shook his head. "The soil's too wet. Could be days old. Could be nothing." But hope had already sunk its claws into the father. He followed the trail, his heart pounding, eyes darting to each indentation in the ground. Step after step, the print seemed to lead them somewhere, until suddenly it stopped. The final imprint pressed against the roots of a gnarled tree, and beyond it, nothing. No continuation, no disturbance in the leaves, as though the earth itself had closed over her passage. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the dogs, straining at their leashes, whimpered and pulled back, ears pinned flat. That night, as lanterns flickered and searchers collapsed from exhaustion, the ruins stood unyielding, their shadows stretching long and black across the field. They had revealed a glimpse of her presence, a ghostly footprint frozen in time, but nothing more. And as the father stared at that single shoe print illuminated by a lone beam of flashlight, one chilling thought wrapped itself around his mind and refused to let go. What if the ruins hadn't hidden her? What if they had taken her? The search eventually thinned, not because the will to find her had weakened, but because time has a cruel way of grinding even the strongest resolve into dust. Weeks stretched into months, months into years, and the ruins remained unchanged, silent, unyielding, and indifferent to the grief that smothered the town below. Her parents refused to let go. Every morning, her father laced up his boots and returned to the fortress grounds, even long after the official search teams had withdrawn their equipment and the flashing lights of patrol cars had disappeared. He carried maps worn soft at the edges, circled the same areas 1,000 times, marked the stone walls with chalk, as if determination alone could crack open the mystery. "Please, come home," her mother whispered each night into the void of the girl's empty bedroom, her fingers brushing across the pillow that still held the faint trace of lavender shampoo. Sometimes she swore she heard footsteps in the hall, soft, fleeting, but when she turned, the space was empty, always empty. The community, too, carried the weight of absence. The ruins, once a place of field trips and history lessons, became cursed ground. School tours were quietly canceled. Locals avoided the field at dusk, whispering that the girl's laughter still lingered in the air, mingling with the rustle of ivy and the mournful cry of crows that gathered on the broken walls. 6 years is an eternity when measured in grief. The girl's classmates grew taller, voices deepened, lives carried forward into graduations, jobs, marriages. Yet in every group photo, there was always an empty space where she should have been, a gap that no one dared fill. At reunions, her name hovered like a ghost, no one wanted to speak aloud. The father grew gaunt, his skin weathered by sun and rain. Neighbors whispered that he was obsessed, that grief had hollowed him out until only obsession remained. But still he searched. He crawled through underground tunnels with nothing but a flashlight, scraped his knees against jagged stone, descended into shafts that smelled of mold and centuries of decay. More than once he emerged gasping, eyes wild, certain he had heard a whisper, her voice calling faintly from the dark. Her mother's grief took a quieter shape. She began leaving her daughter's favorite meal on the table once a week, a ritual she never explained. She folded laundry for a child who no longer came home, her hands trembling as she smoothed invisible wrinkles. And every year on the anniversary she placed a candle at the edge of the ruins, its flame flickering against the night as if trying to summon the girl back. The town police had long since closed their file. Insufficient evidence of foul play, the report had read, cold and final. But in the privacy of their homes, detectives still traded theories. Some were convinced she had been taken, pulled into a van by someone who knew the roads, someone who understood the layout of the ruins well enough to vanish undetected. Others still clung to the belief that she had slipped into the fortress's hidden catacombs, her body lying somewhere deep beneath the earth, unreachable. But there was no body, no belongings, no proof, nothing. And then, After 6 years of suffocating silence, the ruins stirred again. A team of archaeologists brought in to study the fortress's foundations began to dig near a collapsed wall on the northern edge. Their spades struck earth, lifting centuries of soil one scoop at a time. The air was thick with dust and history, the scrape of metal against stone echoing in the emptiness. What they unearthed that day would fracture the silence wide open. A satchel, torn, half buried, its contents waiting like a message from the grave. The morning they found it, the air hung thick with the smell of freshly turned earth and damp stone. The archaeologists had been at the site for weeks, their tools scraping against history, uncovering relics of kings long buried beneath ivy and ruin. But no one expected to unearth something far more recent, something that did not belong to the centuries-old fortress, but to a girl who had walked its grounds only 6 years before. The dig began quietly. Shovels bit into the soil at the base of a collapsed wall on the northern edge, the sound rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Dust rose with every strike of metal, catching in beams of pale sunlight that pierced the morning fog. Then came the sound, different from stone, softer than earth. A muffled thud, as though metal had struck cloth. "Hold on," one archaeologist muttered, crouching lower. He brushed the soil away with his gloved hands, revealing a fragment of fabric. Browned with age, brittle, yet unmistakably modern. The silence around the pit deepened, broken only by the rapid scrape of trowels and the hiss of breath drawn too sharply. Minutes later, they lifted it free, a satchel, torn at the seams, caked with soil. Its straps were frayed, buckles rusted, but even in its ruined state, it carried an aura that froze every hand around it. Because in the back of their minds, they all knew whose it might be. When the satchel was laid on the table in the makeshift tent, gloved fingers pried it open with painstaking care. Out spilled fragments of a life cut short, a half-faded notebook, pages smudged with ink and soil, a folded ticket stub from the school bus company dated the day of the trip, a broken keychain with a cartoon charm. Each item was laid carefully under plastic sheeting, but each carried the weight of a ghost. One archaeologist whispered what the others already felt. "It's hers." Later that evening, when detectives reopened the case files under buzzing fluorescent lights, the satchel lay at the center of the table. Officers leaned in, whispering theories that dissolved into static. The father, when shown the bag, collapsed into a chair, fingers trembling as they hovered above the fabric. His lips moved soundlessly before a hoarse whisper escaped. "This was hers. I packed it myself." But among the expected belongings was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. A small object, metal, darkened with age, unlike anything the family recognized. It was heavier than it looked, its surface etched with markings too faint to decipher. "Could be nothing," one detective muttered, turning it in the light. "Or it could mean she wasn't alone." Forensics would later confirm the soil packed into the satchel had settled only a few years earlier, long after the girl had vanished. Which meant one impossible thing: the satchel hadn't lain buried since the day she disappeared. It had been moved, placed deliberately, as if someone wanted it found. The ruins had finally yielded a clue, but instead of bringing clarity, it opened a darker abyss. Because the satchel whispered of two truths: her undeniable presence at the ruins that day, and the chilling possibility that someone had returned long after to bury the last trace of her life. And somewhere, beneath that unearthed silence, lingered the unanswerable question: who had touched her belongings last? The girl herself, or the one who made her vanish? When word spread that a satchel had been unearthed from the fortress grounds, the silence that had settled over the case for 6 years cracked open like brittle glass. The cold files, gathering dust in the archives, were pulled from storage. Detectives who had long since moved on to other cases now found themselves staring once again at the photographs of a girl frozen in time, bright eyes, a wide smile, forever 13. The ruins became a hive of activity once more. Police tape fluttered in the wind, its stark yellow edges slapping against stone walls. Officers in dark jackets moved with clipped precision, cataloging the site where the satchel had been found. Every spade mark, every grain of disturbed earth was photographed. The air hummed with radios and the low murmur of detectives trading theories under their breath. At the center of it all stood the girl's father. His hair had thinned, his face more deeply lined, but his eyes burned with the same fire that had never dimmed since the day she vanished. He watched as evidence bags were filled, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched. "Why now?" he demanded, voice sharp, brittle with grief. "Why 6 years later? Who buried it? And why would they leave her things here, at the very place she disappeared?" The lead detective avoided his gaze. "That's what we're here to find out." The satchel was transported to the forensic lab, where specialists leaned over its contents beneath harsh white light. The familiar belongings, the notebook, the bus ticket, the charm were laid out with clinical detachment, but it was the foreign object, the small piece of marked metal, that drew the most attention. Experts traced their fingers over its etchings, whispering that the markings didn't match any modern manufacturer. Theories bloomed. A trinket from a local, a fragment from an older excavation, perhaps even something planted. For the family, it was not the object, but the soil analysis that shattered their fragile composure. Forensics revealed the dirt clinging to the bag had not settled 6 years earlier. It had been disturbed, more recently, perhaps only 3, which meant the satchel hadn't lain buried since her disappearance. It had been moved. Her mother collapsed into tears upon hearing the news, clutching the strap of the satchel like it was her daughter's arm. "She was out there," she sobbed. "Alive, maybe. For years. And we didn't know." Detectives tried to temper expectations, but in the quiet corners of the room, the whispers grew darker. If the girl had survived for a time after her disappearance, then someone had kept her hidden. And if someone had buried her satchel deliberately, then they had walked freely near the ruins, unseen, years after the search had ended. Local villagers, who had once dismissed the disappearance as tragic misadventure, now whispered of other possibilities. One old farmer claimed he'd seen torchlight moving near the ruins late at night, years after the case went cold. Another swore he'd heard a girl's cry carried on the wind. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, but after the satchel, nothing seemed impossible. Detectives pressed deeper into the fortress. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in, scanning beneath the soil for cavities, voids, anything that might conceal further evidence. The father walked alongside them, refusing to stand idle. At one point his flashlight beam caught a narrow fissure in the stone, just wide enough for a body to slip through. His breath caught, and he whispered, "Could she have been dragged down there?" Investigators explored the fissure, their boots crunching against centuries of debris. The air was stale, suffocating, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of rust or perhaps something else. They emerged empty-handed, but with faces pale and drawn, as if the silence of the chamber had pressed too heavily against their chests. Back in the command tent, the lead detective pinned photographs to a board. The satchel, the footprint from years ago, the hollow where the dogs had lost the scent. Red string connected the points, but no clear picture emerged. "What we have," he said grimly, "is not a disappearance in isolation. Someone placed that satchel. Someone came back here, long after the world had stopped looking." The room fell into a heavy silence, because if someone had returned, then the girl's story was not just about vanishing, it was about being kept away. And in that silence, a chilling possibility began to fester. If her satchel had been left as a message, then what else might be buried beneath the ruins, still waiting to be found? The discovery of the satchel should have narrowed the search, but instead it opened a floodgate of confusion. Every whisper, every rumor, every half-truth that had clung to the ruins for 6 years surged back with new urgency. What had once been dismissed as folklore suddenly demanded attention. Detectives combed the village again, knocking on doors, notebooks in hand. Each home carried its own version of the girl's fate. "She ran away," one shopkeeper insisted. "Children dream of escaping. Maybe she found someone to help her." But her mother shook her head violently when told of this. Run away and leave her books, her room, her whole life behind? No, she was taken from me. She didn't leave. Others told darker stories. An old woman, eyes clouded with cataracts, leaned on her cane as she spoke to officers. "There are tunnels beneath that place," she rasped. "Older than the fortress itself. People disappear down there. The ground remembers, and it doesn't let go." Investigators sent teams to check these tunnels. Flashlights illuminated ancient carvings, jagged walls slick with moss, pools of stagnant water where insects writhed. They found relics, rusted nails, pottery shards, coins stamped with symbols long forgotten, but no trace of the missing girl. Still, whispers spread, maybe she had been hidden there once, then moved. Then came the rumor of a cult. A young man, jittery and pale, told detectives that he'd once seen hooded figures near the ruins at night. They lit candles, he said, chanted. I swear it. When asked why he hadn't come forward earlier, he muttered, because people don't believe until someone disappears. Police investigated, finding remnants of wax near the ruins, but no proof of ritual. Yet the story spiraled through the community, each retelling adding darker flourishes, sacrifices, forbidden rites, whispers of curses tied to the land. Theories tangled, each pulling the investigation further from clarity. Some claimed she'd been abducted by a passing traveler, spirited away onto the open road, her satchel discarded years later to confuse the search. Others clung to the idea of an accident, that she had fallen into a hidden shaft, her belongings moved only when construction disturbed the earth. The father, listening to these spirals, clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. Every lie, every rumor, he growled, it steals time from the truth. He spent his nights returning alone to the ruins, flashlight trembling in his hand, searching cracks and alcoves no one else dared crawl into. One evening, a villager intercepted him at the path. The man's face was thin, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. You should know, he said quietly, I've seen things. Not years ago, recently. Lights, torches moving near the ruins. People walking where no one should walk. The father's breath hitched. When? Last winter, the man muttered, eyes shifting nervously. More than once. I thought I was imagining it. But maybe I wasn't. When the father repeated this to detectives, they dismissed it. Probably hikers, they said, people exploring. But in his heart, the father felt something else, the certainty that whoever had taken his daughter had returned again and again, haunting the ruins like a shadow that refused to leave. And as the days dragged on, the lines between truth and fabrication blurred until even seasoned investigators couldn't tell fact from fantasy. Every clue dissolved under scrutiny, every lead led only into darkness. But one thing refused to fade, the image of torchlight flickering against broken stone, and the haunting possibility that someone was still out there, moving freely through the ruins under cover of night. The case, once again, began to slip from the authorities' grasp, but for the father, those rumors weren't distractions. They were warnings. Because in his bones, he knew behind every false lead, there was always a grain of truth. And if torchlight had truly flickered in those ruins, then someone had been there. Someone who might still be hiding secrets buried deeper than the satchel. The world moved on, but he did not. For 6 years, he had carried the weight of her absence, and now, with the satchel unearthed, that weight grew heavier, sharper, a blade pressed against his heart. While investigators scribbled theories on whiteboards and neighbors whispered stories of curses, the girl's father became something else entirely, a man possessed. His mornings began before dawn. He walked the same dirt road to the ruins with a flashlight dangling from one hand and a crowbar in the other, his figure hunched against the chill. The fortress walls loomed ahead like jagged sentinels, watching, waiting. Most people avoided this place after nightfall. He made it his second home. Locals whispered about him now. The Mad Father, they called him. They saw him digging near collapsed walls, crawling into gaps so narrow most men wouldn't dare. Some nights, they claimed, they heard his voice echoing across the ruins, hoarse, desperate, calling his daughter's name into the void. But he didn't care. His grief had calcified into obsession. Inside his house, stacks of papers covered the dining table, maps of the ruins, sketches of tunnels, photocopies of ancient documents pulled from archives. Red ink circled spots he hadn't searched, arrows pointed toward fissures and voids. On the walls, photographs of his daughter smiled down at him, pinned beside scraps of notes, scrawled in his own trembling hand. She was here. They moved her. Why? One night, his wife pleaded with him, voice cracking under the strain. You're tearing yourself apart. Please, stop. Come back to me. He shook his head, staring at the papers. If I stop, she stays gone. I can't live with that. Tears streaked her face. You're losing yourself. No, he whispered, I'm finding her. So he kept searching. Crawling through the ruins' underbelly, he found remnants of the past, bones of animals, shards of pottery, rusted weapons from centuries gone. Yet every scrape of his crowbar, every echo of his boots against stone, carried the hope that one day the sound would change, that he'd break through into a chamber no one had ever seen, and find the truth waiting in the dark. And then, one evening, he did. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the fortress. He'd been prying at a collapsed section of wall when his crowbar slid into a gap. The stone shifted with a hollow groan, and a gust of stale, cold air hissed out, carrying with it the scent of decay. His heart lurched. He pressed his flashlight into the opening. The beam cut across rough stone and revealed a narrow passage sloping downward into blackness. Dust swirled in the beam, as though disturbed for the first time in decades. His breath came ragged. This is it, he whispered, voice trembling. This is where she went. He squeezed inside, scraping his shoulders against jagged rock, his flashlight quivering in his hand. The air grew heavy, suffocating. His boots crunched over loose stones as he descended into a chamber that widened suddenly, revealing walls scarred with strange markings. Scratches, deliberate and erratic, etched into the stone. He ran his fingers across them, the grooves rough under his touch. His chest tightened as a thought gripped him. These weren't made centuries ago. These were desperate. He staggered back, flashlight trembling as it caught something darker smeared faintly across the stone. Not dust, not moss, but something stained, something old. Blood. His breath caught in his throat. He staggered out of the chamber, scrambling into the night, the ruins pressing against him like a living thing. For the first time in years, he felt both vindicated and destroyed. Vindicated that his search had not been madness, that there was something hidden, something buried. Destroyed because the evidence was undeniable. His daughter had been there, and she had suffered. The next morning, detectives reluctantly followed him back into the chamber. They examined the scratches, photographed the stains. Forensics later confirmed what he already knew in his bones. The blood was hers. The chamber had been a prison. And for the father, the obsession that had once been fueled by hope twisted into something far darker, a need to know who had dragged his daughter into the earth and why they had left only her blood behind. The chamber swallowed light. Even with 3 industrial flashlights piercing the dark, the space seemed to resist illumination, as though the walls themselves drank in every beam. Dust hung in the air like a pale fog, stirred by their footsteps, each particle carrying centuries of silence. The father stood among the detectives, his chest heaving with a mixture of triumph and dread. He had begged them to see it, to crawl where no one wanted to crawl. And now, here they were, standing inside the hidden gut of the ruins, the place he believed had held his daughter. The walls were scarred. Deep, frantic scratches marked the stone, overlapping like desperate handwriting. Some were gouges so fierce that flakes of rock still curled outward, as if torn by fingernails or something sharp. The father pressed trembling fingers into the grooves, his breath faltering. She was here. She tried to get out. One detective muttered under his breath, "Could be ancient." The father turned sharply, eyes blazing. "No, these are fresh. Look at them. They're not worn, not weathered. She made these." The air smelled strange, musty, but beneath that, something metallic, faint, and unmistakable. The scent of blood never truly fades. It lingers in stone like a curse. Near one corner, the flashlight beam caught the faint smear again, darker against the pale rock. A sample was taken, sealed in plastic. Later, lab tests would confirm the truth. The blood was hers. But there was more. Scattered across the chamber floor lay fragments, small bones gnawed smooth by time, not human, but unsettling nonetheless. Rodents, perhaps, or birds that had stumbled inside and never left. A broken shoe sole, weathered and brittle. A strip of fabric, half buried in dust, each artifact catalogued, each weighed down with implication. The detectives moved with a strange tension, professionally detached, yet visibly unsettled. One crouched near the wall, where the scratches thickened, running his gloved hand over a section where the marks formed jagged letters. Shapes emerged in the dust, crude but undeniable. Her name, carved unevenly, as though made in the dark, as though every letter had been dragged into existence with the last strength of trembling fingers. The room went still. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the father's ragged breathing stopped as his eyes fixed on the letters. "She called for us," he whispered hoarsely. "All this time she was calling for us." The silence pressed heavier. One officer finally broke it, his voice low. "But if she wrote this here, then where did she go? How did she get out?" The question hung in the chamber like smoke, because there was no other exit, no tunnel beyond, no shaft leading upward. Just solid stone on every side. It was a tomb. The father's knees buckled, and he sank against the wall, his hands covering his face. He could still imagine her in that darkness, her small hands tearing at the stone until her nails bled, her voice echoing until it cracked into silence. Outside, when they emerged hours later, the ruins no longer looked like a relic of history. They looked like a predator, a vast carcass that had devoured what was most precious to him and hidden the remains deep in its bones. The detectives tried to temper conclusions. "Evidence of her presence," they said carefully. "Not evidence of what happened after. The blood could predate her death. She could have been injured, left alive." But the father could not hear them. His mind replayed the scratches, the smeared letters, the name carved in stone. He knew with certainty that his daughter had been there, terrified, fighting for her life in the dark. And if she hadn't escaped, then someone had carried her away from that chamber. The chamber revealed horrors, yes, but it also revealed a deeper question, one that clawed at everyone who stood inside. If she left her name behind, then who made sure the rest of her never followed? The evidence bags lay on the sterile steel table, glowing under fluorescent lights that hummed with an almost sinister monotony. Each bag contained fragments of horror, soil samples, shards of fabric, the blood-stained rock scraped from the chamber wall. For days the items sat in the lab, passing through gloved hands and clinical instruments, while the family lived in suspended animation, waiting for words that might either bury hope forever or ignite it with terrible possibility. The father refused to leave the precinct. He lingered in the lobby like a restless shadow, pacing the length of the floor until his steps wore a path into the tile. His wife sat silently in a chair, hands locked together, whispering prayers under her breath. Neither ate, neither slept. They were waiting for a verdict that had already branded itself in their hearts. When the forensic specialist finally emerged, file in hand, the room's air thickened. His eyes avoided theirs. He laid the report flat on the table, tapping the page once before speaking. "The DNA from the blood found in the chamber," he paused, his voice faltering. "It's hers. There's no question." The mother's cry shattered the silence. It was not a scream, not a wail, something lower, more guttural, like the sound of a body breaking open. She folded in on herself, her fingers clawing at her chest, as if she could tear the grief straight out of her heart. The father's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white, his jaw trembling as he forced the words past his lips. "She was alive down there," he whispered, "alive long enough to bleed, alive long enough to carve her name." The detective across the table shifted uncomfortably. "It proves she was present, but it doesn't confirm death. She could have survived, been moved." "No." The father slammed his fists onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Don't twist this. She was there. She begged for us, and we didn't hear her." Silence followed. The truth hung heavy. The scratches on the wall, the smeared letters, the name carved with agonized precision, they weren't just relics, they were a message, a record of a child's final hours or days, clawed into stone with desperate hope. The lab results deepened the mystery. Alongside her DNA were faint traces of another individual, partial, degraded, but unmistakably human. Too little for identification. Too much to ignore. "Someone else was in that chamber," the forensic specialist murmured. the implications sank like ice. If she hadn't been alone, then who had been down there with her? A captor? Another victim? Or worse, a shadow moving through the ruins, controlling the narrative, burying evidence where only time could conceal it. The father stared at the photographs spread across the table, close-ups of the scratches, the smeared blood, the carved name. His daughter's voice echoed in his mind, not as memory but as imagination, the sound of her fingernails raking stone, the whisper of her breath fading in the dark. At home, the mother sat before her daughter's bedroom door, unable to cross the threshold. Inside, the room remained untouched, frozen in time. Posters peeling slightly at the corners, books stacked haphazardly on the desk, a stuffed animal perched on the bed. She pressed her forehead to the doorframe and whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have been there. I should have heard you." Detectives, meanwhile, debated late into the night. One insisted it had been an accident, that she'd stumbled into the chamber, injured herself, and died before anyone could find her. Another scoffed, pointing to the satchel's relocation, the presence of foreign DNA, accident. Someone buried her belongings years later. Someone wanted us to find that bag, but not her body. The caseboard filled again with photographs, strings of red yarn connecting theories that branched into dead ends. If someone was in that chamber with her, one detective said grimly, then either they left her there to die, or they took her out alive and buried the truth. The father refused to wait. Alone, flashlight in hand, he returned to the chamber. He traced his fingers over the scratches, whispered her name, pressed his ear against the wall, as though stone might confess its secrets. Hours later, he stumbled out, wild-eyed, his clothes streaked with dust. "She's still here," he muttered to anyone who would listen. "They took her, but she's still here." Word spread quickly through the village. Some whispered she had been sacrificed, her blood sealing a curse that would last generations. Others swore she had been trafficked, spirited away into the world beyond, with the chamber nothing more than a cruel diversion. Theories multiplied like weeds, choking out reason. But for her parents, only two truths mattered. The chamber had held her, and she had left a piece of herself behind. Her blood on stone, her name carved with dying hands. Proof that she had not vanished into thin air, as officials once claimed, but had fought against her fate in the belly of the ruins. The report closed with one damning line: "Further investigation required, perpetrator unknown." The mother clutched that page to her chest as though it were her daughter's diary. The father burned with fury, not grief. He vowed that if the police could not unearth the rest of the truth, then he would, because evidence this disturbing was not an ending, it was a warning. And warnings meant there was more still hidden, deeper in the ruins, waiting to claw its way to the surface. The discovery of blood in the chamber should have brought the case closer to resolution, but instead it cracked the story open into an abyss of speculation. The ruins no longer belonged to history. They belonged to rumor, obsession, and fear. Every person who had ever heard the girl's name now carried their own explanation, their own version of events. Some were grounded in evidence, others in shadows, but all were fueled by one undeniable truth: nothing about her disappearance had ever made sense. It began with the journalists. The story reignited, in headlines that splashed across local and national papers alike, evidence of child found in fortress chamber. Reporters arrived in droves, their vans parked along the winding road, cameras flashing against the ancient stones. They interviewed villagers, detectives, even the girl's grieving parents. One journalist pressed the father outside his home. "Do you believe she was taken?" he asked. The father's eyes, bloodshot and hollow, burned with fury. "I believe someone put her there," he snapped. "My daughter didn't crawl into that chamber to carve her name for fun. Someone trapped her." The journalist nodded, scribbling furiously, but his expression betrayed curiosity more than empathy. And when the article went live, the headline twisted the father's anguish into spectacle: "Grieving parent suggests cult activity in fortress disappearance." The word cult spread like fire. The villagers had whispered of it for years: hooded figures, candlelight rituals among the ruins. Now, with the girl's blood confirmed in a hidden chamber, the whispers surge. Rumors claimed the chamber had been used for offerings. Some even said the satchel had been planted deliberately as part of a ritual, a signal for those who knew how to read it. Investigators rolled their eyes, calling it superstition. But late-night footage shot by a villager told another story, a group of silhouettes moving along the fortress ridge, torches flickering in their hands. Whether pranksters or something darker, no one could say. But the images were grainy, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Theories tangled. Could the girl have been taken as part of some archaic rite? Could her bloodstains have been left behind intentionally, a mark rather than a clue? The father, hearing these rumors, clenched his fist so hard his nails drew blood. "Stop making her a story," he raged. "She was a child, my child, not a symbol for your curses." Yet even he, in the darkest corners of his mind, wondered. Others insisted on something more human, more monstrous. Journalists pointed to regional trafficking routes, suggesting the ruins had been a hiding place, a way station before the girl was spirited away. The satchel's relocation years later, they argued, was a mistake. Someone slipping, losing control of their narrative. Detectives debated this bitterly. One said, if she was trafficked, why leave evidence in the chamber? Another countered, because they wanted to confuse us, because they knew we'd spend years digging in the wrong place. The mother recoiled from this theory, unable to stomach the thought of her daughter taken into a world of unending torment. But the father found a grim logic in it. If she had been trafficked, then perhaps, just perhaps, she had lived beyond the chamber. Perhaps she was still alive somewhere, that single thread of hope twisted inside him like a knife. Experts brought in by the archaeological team proposed yet another angle. The ruins are unstable, one geologist explained on camera. It's possible she fell through a natural fissure. Injuries could have caused blood loss. The chamber might not have been a prison, just a trap created by the earth itself. But if that were true, why were her belongings buried years later? Why had the satchel been moved? The contradictions piled up like stones in an unsolvable puzzle. Online forums lit up with voices convinced of a cover-up. They speculated that local authorities had known more all along, that the satchel's discovery was staged to distract from failures in the original search. Some went further, suggesting ties between officials and shadowy networks. Photographs of detectives, grainy and taken at odd angles, circulated online with captions like, "Look into his past, he knows." The family was horrified. "They're turning her into a conspiracy," the mother whispered. "She's not their entertainment, but once theories take root on the internet, they grow uncontrollably, each rumor feeding the next, until truth is strangled." Then came the discovery that shook even the investigators. Weeks after the first satchel, an archaeologist digging in a different sector uncovered another, smaller, newer, buried less deeply. Inside, scraps of clothing, a water bottle, and a notebook with pages so decayed they fell apart when touched. The items were not conclusively hers, but they matched her style, her school's supplies. "Why would there be two satchels?" one detective demanded, slamming his fist against the table. "Who's planting them, and why?" Theories erupted again. Some said the second satchel was a decoy, planted by whoever had moved the first. Others claimed it was genuine, proof that she had survived longer than anyone dared hope, leaving belongings behind as she was shifted from place to place. But the father saw something more chilling. Holding the photograph of the second satchel, his voice shook. "This isn't a mistake, this is a message. Someone wants us chasing her ghost forever." The ruins, once a place of silence, now echoed with speculation. Journalists camped near the site, cameras rolling day and night. Volunteers searched anew, guided less by evidence and more by desperation. And through it all, the family stood at the center, battered by every rumor, every false hope. The father's obsession deepened. He pinned articles to his wall, lines of red thread weaving a labyrinth of theories that led everywhere and nowhere. He circled words: cult, trafficking, accident, conspiracy, until the ink dug holes in the paper. His wife begged him to stop. "They're breaking you," she said softly. But he only shook his head. "No, they're leading me closer, closer to whoever did this." And in the end, one haunting truth rose above the noise. Every theory, Every contradiction circled back to the same place, the ruins. No matter how far the rumors stretched, they always returned to those stones, to the chamber carved with her name, to the satchels buried like breadcrumbs. The ruins were not done speaking, and if there was a message hidden beneath their silence, it was this. The girl's story was not over. Not yet. The ruins stood silent once more, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the quiet of history, nor even the quiet of abandonment. It was the silence of something that had devoured, of stone that remembered screams, of soil that had drunk blood and held its secret for years. The fortress had become less a relic and more a wound, and for those who lived in its shadow, that wound never closed. The girl's mother never stopped setting her place at the table. Even as seasons shifted and years passed, a plate was laid out, silverware aligned, as though her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. Friends whispered it was madness, but she called it faith. "If I stop waiting for her," she murmured once, "then I've admitted she's gone." The father's life twisted into something harder, darker. He walked the ruins daily, long after officials ordered them closed. He snuck past police tape, carrying nothing but a flashlight and his own guilt. His neighbors stopped calling his name. They knew he no longer belonged to them. He belonged to the fortress, to the chamber, to the carved letters on the wall. He was no longer a man searching for his daughter. He was a man tethered to the place that had taken her. The marriage fractured under the weight of grief. The mother withdrew, moving between rooms like a shadow. The father burned himself alive on obsession. Some evenings they sat in silence across from one another, not as husband and wife, but as two ruins of the people they once were. Their daughter was the absence between them, a presence more powerful in her silence than she had ever been in life. The town itself was poisoned by the case. Children grew up with warnings whispered like fairy tales. Stay away from the fortress, don't wander near the ruins after dark, or the stones will take you too. School trips ceased. The fields, once alive with laughter, grew over with weeds. The fortress was fenced off, signs posted, danger, no entry. But still people came. Some out of morbid curiosity, others to whisper prayers or leave flowers at the locked gates. The villagers argued endlessly about what had happened. Some swore she had been taken by traffickers. Others clung to the cult theory, insisting they had seen torchlight on the ridge even in recent years. A smaller few believed she had died in an accident, her belongings manipulated later to keep fear alive. But no one could ignore the carved letters, the blood on the wall. Whatever else might be dismissed, those couldn't. For decades, the ruins had been a monument to history. Now, they were a monument to loss. For the detectives, the case became a specter that followed them long after retirement. They replayed their decisions in the still hours of the night. Had they dismissed the danger too quickly in those first hours? Had they written her off as a runaway when every sign screamed otherwise? Some drowned their guilt in drink, others in silence, but all carried her name etched into their memories like those scratches in stone. One detective confessed, years later, in an interview for a documentary, "I can still hear the father's voice. Every time he shouted her name into those ruins, I hear it in my dreams, and I wonder if she heard him, down there scratching at the walls." The case became folklore, not just in the village, but beyond. Writers, podcasters, filmmakers, all came, trying to capture the story, to pin it down like an insect under glass. But the truth slipped away from them, just as she had slipped from her classmates' sight that day. The more people tried to explain it, the more it seemed to resist explanation. For her classmates, now adults, the memory was sharper than glass. Many refused to speak publicly. One, after years of silence, confessed, "We were playing, we thought she'd catch up. I still dream about turning back and seeing her there, smiling, but in the dream, her face fades before I reach her." Every anniversary, candles appeared at the edge of the ruins. Some placed by her family, others by strangers who had never known her but felt her absence like a shadow cast across their own lives. The flames flickered against the stone, fragile lights against an endless darkness. What lingered most was not certainty, but absence. No body, no definitive ending, just blood, A name carved in stone and belongings buried as if by invisible hand. The fortress held its secrets as tightly as it had for centuries, and though pieces of her story had surfaced, the whole remained buried deeper than any archaeologist could dig. The father, older now, walks the ruins still. His hair is white, his steps slower, but his resolve is unchanged. Some evenings villagers see his flashlight weaving across the broken stones, a lone star moving through the dark. They say he talks to her, whispering into the night, asking for forgiveness. Some say he hears her answer. The mother visits less often, but when she does, she kneels at the gate, presses her hand to the cold iron and whispers, "Come home." Then she lights a candle and walks away without looking back. And the ruins remain, watching, waiting, holding their silence. Because in the end, the most terrifying thing was not what was found, but what remained hidden. And somewhere, etched forever into the stone of that hidden chamber, a name waits her name, reminding all who enter that some vanishings never end. They echo, they haunt, and they never truly let go.